Hi, it's Paula from the future, just giving you a heads up that this episode has a bit of wonky audio at points. We did our best to try and fix it, but that's what happens when we live in different parts of the country and we're not recording in the studio. But regardless, today's episode is fantastic. For this episode, we also want to say that there is links to specific organizations that Erika has recommended. So please, if you are financially able to, make sure to donate. With that said, on to the show.
Hello!
Hello, bonjour!
For our cold open this week, I guess I will just talk about what I've only been talking about, which is Marvel Rivals. I cannot have a normal hobby. I've officially become a part of an esports organization. I'm entering like proper tournaments. I'm in there. I'm becoming great. I'm becoming like the best, to be honest. I was on the leaderboard for Cloak and Dagger. If you play Marvel Rivals, I was number 1 in the world for like a few days.
You did not tell me this.
I didn't tell you this. Wait, I thought I'd text you at like 4 a.m. in the morning. I'm currently jobless, almost. My job ends today. It's like the end of July. I'm giving very unemployed, is what I'd like to say. Somebody hire me so I can stop.
Or can someone give us a lot of money in sponsorships? Please and thank you.
Sponsor me, and I'll still be unemployed.
Honestly, I will sponsor vape pens in any country.
Yeah, Paula, what have you been doing? DJing?
Okay, listen, do I have talent in it? No. Am I having fun? Yes. So I mean, I'm in the final stretch of the PhD. I have to get an extension because I had surgery and then I broke my arm. So typing has not been the best. I had gotten myself this little DJ controller thing ages ago, and I was like, I'll learn to do this, and then I never did.
I'm just vibing. How have you been doing? I know you've been traveling, right?
Yeah, so I just came back from Indonesia, which was amazing. It was my first time there. I went to the beach to Bali, which seemed very surreal. But I was just like, oh my god, finally, having a coconut, looking at the sea. I was like, oh my god, I made it to paradise. The situation is quite complex, and it was very interesting also, like being in Jakarta and also seeing the effects of climate change there. But at the same time, the food is amazing. I stuffed my face with Indonesian food and found it as like now is one of my top favorite foods in the world. So I'm definitely going to look for more Indonesian restaurants now. And yeah, before that I was in Spain. So, and then I'm going to Mexico in a few weeks. So it's a whole like world tour.
So many planes. Oh, this is the first episode we're recording that is after all the chaos. Apologies that the release schedule has not been on track. I had surgery at the beginning of July. Something that had a 1% chance of happening happened to me. Separately, these are separate things. I had my PhD Viva, which I passed, which was great. But then I've obviously had to do the very minor corrections, and like it's just been a time for me. So I've been going through it. So you're just unfortunately you're gonna have to deal with the wonky release schedule. So people are gonna have to be a little patient with me. Yeah. So I guess for our audience, welcome to Theoryish. Erika, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. I'm teaching at Warwick. Well, not until long, but I've been teaching on gender and racism and a bit of migration. And I'm originally from Mexico, but now living in the UK for 7 years. And yeah, finished my PhD in sociology. Did the thought it was a good idea to turn it into a book, which was amazing and challenging and difficult and yeah, great. Very happy about that. Yeah, I think that's me.
It was a very good idea to turn it into a book. It's a good book, which everyone should read.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because people sometimes say, "Oh, go first for the articles, and then you can think about the book once you get, like the permanent position and everything." But I was just like, I love books. I just want a book. I just want to do it, and yeah, there was a paper in between and stuff like blog posts and this, but I just went for it. Yeah, no doubt about it. But yeah, it was like when I was writing the book, Trump was in the first administration. I thought afterwards things seemed to change with COVID, obviously. So, in terms of policy and when it comes to migration and asylum seeking and refuge, like things change super, super quickly. So I was like, this is like, and thinking about the book, like, how do I make this relevant and how do I not like, how do I make it so it doesn't feel like dated? And then, like, I never thought Trump would be in office again. So for some reason, that had that sort of weird consequence in which, some of the policies I describe, or, like obviously the situation with undocumented migrants and asylum seekers is still very much similar. Although, things repeat and things also not stay the same. So
do you want to give a introduction to the book and also say the name just so people can know? They'll see it anyway on the episode description and stuff.
Yeah, so my book is Ambivalent Humanitarianism and Migration Control and Colonial Legacies and the Experiences of Migrants in Mexico. So it's quite big. A big title, but I really kind of wanted to capture kind of the key themes. And having said that, basically the book talks about, humanitarian organizations are based in Mexico, in the southern border, in the northern border, and also in the center, and how sort of they treat migrants, right? What is the relationship? How do they interact? And sort of the central question was always like, in a nutshell, do they help? To what extent they help, or is it that they hinder them in any way? So yeah, with that in mind, kind of I was investigating and kind of researching more on these organizations, and I was focusing also on migrants, and specifically migrants from Central American countries and in the northern part of Central America. So these are Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And I focus on that because in Mexico there's really growing anti-Central American sentiment, migrants that are crossing, and many of them at the time were from Central America, that are crossing to get to the US. So it was sort of to see, Mexico used to be like a traditional sending country. Now is much more of a mixed country in which, you have migrants who are immigrating, and also who are returning, who are being deported. But what happens with a country that also is supposed to receive and accommodate forced displacement? So also I wanted to kind of see that sort of complex picture. And the main argument was that a lot of these organizations are ambivalent in the way they help, and in many times, they do provide basic services. They provide basic humanitarian aid that is really, really important to migrants, that is necessary, that people are very grateful for that. But at the same time, the impact and sort of the consequence goes beyond just those kind of instances, and it does impact, their life, their migrant trajectories, their journeys. It impacts also how they feel, even their identity. So that was quite like major finding. And then the book sort of talks about a bit about the background, kind of also the historical side of it in terms of the colonial aspect, going from kind of the Spanish rule, but also the US intervention in Central America, and also the economical dependency with Mexico. And then it goes into kind of the empirical side, in which I go into kind of each stage in which migrants have to kind of are received or hosted by these organization, the shelters, they say, okay, yeah, how is it that they start receiving the aid, and then what happens afterwards, and what happens kind of at the end? Are they really helping them continuing, or in many cases, they're kind of dissuading migrants from continuing on their journey? Yeah, I think if I could summarize the book, it would be, something like this.
Yes, yeah. I think the book is fascinating, to be honest. Like, I was reading it. Me and Erika were doing our PhDs together. Erika was a few years ahead of me. I forget how far. I was there for too long. So I remember when you came back from your fieldwork. I think to kind of kick us off then, maybe thinking about the methodology of how you did this research. Your data is so rich. People just say that all the time, but the quotes you have are so candid at times. You've mixed that with a little bit of documentary analysis. At the beginning of chapter 6, you talk about going to an event where you were surprised there were loads of celebrities there. Like, all this kind of stuff that showcases how integrated you were into these NGOs and organizations and all this kind of stuff. Thinking in terms of our listeners who are early career PhD students, how do you kind of build up those relationships? How do you even get in there, right? I imagine it's an ethical nightmare.
Yeah, so picking up on field work that was very intense. It was kind of how I built kind of the research and later the book. So I guess the methodology starts before the fieldwork, and even before the PhD, I was actually volunteering for a few months in one of these NGOs in Mexico City, where I'm from. Yeah, I started to like seeing some stuff that I was like, interesting, but I was more interested in migrants, right? And how they were getting on, what was kind of their needs, their experiences. But then I thought, well, actually, what's happening right here is very, very interesting, all the dynamics inside the organizations. So when kind of approaching the methodology, I had a pretty good idea on, how many of these organizations they are in Mexico. There are about like 100, a bit more, some say like 200. It depends on kind of how you're defining us, that are very kind of flexible, also very diverse amongst them as well. But I had like some sense of how many they are, how they would go about it. They also, they have kind of this network set up in Mexico where they're talking with each other, they know about each other, there's like public documents. So also I wanted to, these documents that are sometimes used in policy, I think for me it was important to think about, well, how are they saying things, and why are they saying it in those terms, and what is beyond that, right? What was like underlying some of the way they were phrasing some of those reports, briefs, whatever. The way I start the methodology, like I envision it, like I'll go back to Mexico City, like knock on some doors, and by that I mean like literally and also like digitally. Cold emailing and being like, hi, how are you? I'm a PhD student. And so I did that combination of emails, combination of Facebook messages, everything I could like do to kind of contact these organizations. And at the same time, one of the things that was really crucial for the fieldwork, and that was always on my mind, was like, oh, I don't want to also harm the people that I talk with or the people I interview with. I know it's like a very difficult situation. A lot of people deal with trauma. So how am I going to kind of deal with that? So during fieldwork, I was thinking about that a lot, and I came across this sort of workshop that they were giving with like, they call it something like first psychological aid to non-practitioners that were dealing with vulnerable populations. I was very lucky because it turns out that in that sort of workshop that lasted for the first stage of my fieldwork, I met a lot of people who actually worked in the organizations. And so it was kind of an introduction of like, oh, hey, I was in the workshop. I would love to interview you. Or, do you know anyone who would be open to interview? So in that way, it was kind of two objectives. Like I got these really good sort of contacts. And at the same time, I was also dealing with my own self-care and how I was going to deal with potentially difficult things should it arise in the interviews. So that was one thing, and sort of did snowball, at some point people were just saying, oh, contact this person, adding me on WhatsApp groups, sending me phone numbers of others, which was, again, I was like super grateful and super lucky. For migrants, at the start, I was like, I didn't want to be super invasive. I think also the idea of the research was, let's, focus also on what's happening kind of in the radius or around migration rather than just going deep in it to talk with migrants. But it turned out that a lot of organizations were putting me in contact with migrants. I got to interview a lot of them, and many that I thought I wouldn't have access to, or they wouldn't like me, and some of did refuse, which I was like happy that they did refuse, because it meant that they were choosing also not to speak or when they were tired of that. But some of them were happy to do it. It's hard to kind of say, but I was like, is this working for you anyhow, like talking with me, like we can stop, of course, if it's too draining. I was also very kind of careful not to probe into difficult things, like not push any limit that I could see that they were kind of putting in when we were speaking. Yeah, it's sort of weird to say, but some did say, like, oh, this actually helped me to talk about this. I didn't get to talk about it so much with other people, and once they knew that I wasn't part of the organization, that I was a student and I was just like, trying to do this research, it sort of then became, they were more open to it to an extent that I didn't anticipate when I started. It was hard too, because I also tried to kind of minimize any kind of extraction, and like, how do I like keep these relations? I kept in contact with some through Facebook. Eventually some of them just stopped connecting or responding. Some of them did also ask, kind of about like their legal cases and this, so I tried to also like put them in touch and just kind of follow through what was happening. At the end of the day, it was at the time of the migrant caravans, so the research was conducted 2018-19. So also part of the research was, this document analysis and these interviews, but me actually, going to the border, working in the caravans, even though that was not my focus of the research, but I thought it was quite important to also see and sort of feel what was happening, to like participate in, they had gatherings, and I went to church with them, so it was also kind of at the end some sort of ethnography, although I didn't intend it to be, but it was just, I guess, out of like just trying to be more sensitive about the situation and have a bit of more coherence with what I wanted to research, but also being a bit more human about it.
I can imagine that being outside of the organization, you're sort of like a neutral space, not only to discuss these things, but also maybe even to just complain. Especially like reading your chapters, there is this image of ideal immigrant and ideal person, and where they had to do this. It's a lot of performance, and I can imagine that your presence there is just like, oh, finally, I don't have to do this.
With migrants, it was also at first a bit like, who are you? Are you a journalist? Are you not? And then I'm like, no, I'm just a student. But of course, also I had the recording, because I was planning on doing the transcriptions and this, and that was also like something. But then once I turned it off, it was also this conversation in which there were a lot of things that were also off the record, just to kind of maintain that sort of relationship, and that being, like external sort of actor. We were suddenly like having these conversations, and they were like, what, we are so swamped with work that it's not easy to sometimes just reflect and talk about this and say, actually this was an issue, or kind of the more self-critical staff members were like, we don't have spaces to talk about this. So it's good. This requires kind of more of our reflections. It also came to that. Of course, doing research implies also a power relation. I mean, it's never going to be, I had an interest to be there, and I mean, I could like minimize it or like attune it or make it as empathic as I could. I did have that position. I was the one that wanted something, wanted my research, right? So I was like, how do I give back, right? That's kind of the question also when it comes to these sort of research or fieldworks that are demanding of like, okay, you have this amount of time to do, it was 9 months to do 38 interviews and different locations. So what do you do, like, to give back if you can't be in the community? If I had to come back to the UK, people were like, when are you coming back? How do I give back to the community? And also kind of thinking it in kind of these decolonial terms. It was more kind of symbolic for me of like taking their work seriously and their knowledge and their insights, and not just being like, oh, well, that person said that on this, but actually take them with the weight of their words. I remember there was like this researcher that said, no research of migrants without migrants, that kind of stayed with me, and that was the way I kind of managed that.
I think your methodology is so in-depth. You covered as much basis as possible. You put in so much work. So much work to take care of people, to also try and take care of yourself and manage your own emotions, to ensure that you're getting as many people's voices as possible, that you're reflecting those voices in particular ways. It's impressive.
It's definitely hard, but yeah, like in the emotional aspect, I didn't see that it would like impact me so much. Just being there and hearing those like stories and meeting people that have been through so much, obviously I started to get very angry, like really, really angry, right? And also I didn't have like the space to work through that, or, journaling, or, you say have these field work notes. And I started also to get very tired, and in my attempt kind of to empathize with what they were going through and what their working conditions were, I also kind of went overboard and was like, I think, just absorbing all those feelings. And I think also that I had to manage that for myself and for the sake of the research and later with the book, because I thought also it's one thing what happens in fieldwork, but then when I was hearing the interviews again, there were more and more emotions coming. And even when I was writing the book, it also came back like some. So I think it's like a process in which, kind of is as emotional, and it's like never really kind of ending that side, but I think is what makes it so engaging as well.
Hannah was explaining to me, in the field of sociology, there's a lot of transcription. So having to sit and transcribing not only their words, but also your own words. Yeah, it's something that obviously I don't do in my own field, and I think it's a very fascinating thing. I think a question for the two of you, which is when you're dealing with like these sort of very intense scenarios, or even just listening to your own self, how are you reflecting in the moment of breaking down these interviews? Or is it one of those things where, after you do the work, you're just like, wait a damn minute. As you're typing, is there questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I think I didn't expect for the transcription and translation part of it to be as fascinating as it was. And I'm still like, oh, this was greater that I was just thought, oh, I'll be like a machine just transcribing everything. Couldn't use I couldn't use software at the time. Like I couldn't find the Spanish one, and the people were like, you just do it manually. Oh, it took so long, like months. I think Hannah can attest. I was just drowning in these transcriptions, but sometimes I would highlight things and be like, you know what? I'm just hearing this over again. This is actually really important because it's quite different. I don't know about you, Hannah, but for me, it's like when I'm in the interviews, you're just thinking of like, okay, what's next? How should I like continue the conversation with the other person? And then in the transcription, you're actually like focusing much more in, oh, how does this relate to the literature? Or actually, this is a really interesting theme. So it's quite like a different process. Yeah, and then you have that, but also it becomes very overwhelming. So at the same time, you have like there's a bunch of them that talked, I don't know, about integration, right? Migrant integration. So let's go for that. And it's actually an interesting kind of subtopic, but also it's quite interesting to hear people again, no, the way they really carry themselves in the interview, some stuff that maybe didn't seem as big, you're hearing back and you're like, oh god. Or even yourself, it's very annoying to hear yourself for so many hours. But it was just something I had to get over myself and just hear and accept the tone of my voice.
Yeah, I think transcription is such an interesting process. I agree. When you're in the interview, you're really balancing your emotions, the participants' emotions, how is each question hitting, am I asking the question in the right way. I noticed when I was doing the transcriptions that sometimes if I was asking a question that I was nervous to ask, it would come across in the way that I would put the question forward. Yeah, you notice things that you didn't notice. There was one interview I did that actually sparked something in my that I ended up talking about in my ethics and my methodology, where when I was doing research on museums, some of the people I was interviewing and speaking to visitors, but I was also speaking to essentially the gatekeepers, right? Like kind of like you, Erika, like you're speaking to the people who are allowing you access to those spaces. And there was one person, like most people were very candid and very open, but there was one person who was I remember the interviewer being like, what is happening? Like when I was doing the interview, I was like, why am I not getting like the usual answers that I expect? And then when I was listening back through, I was like, oh, they're being very guarded. They're being very guarded because they don't want to put their institution in a particular light. And I was like, that's so interesting because I can't push too far as a researcher because they are the person giving me access to a site. But I'm not getting the information I need because they're being so guarded. And so, like, it's balancing stuff like that. But again, some of that stuff, you'll feel it in the moment, but you won't realize till after what has happened or what is happening, or you will sometimes get particular words that, like, impress upon you. Like, I have just written an article. I think I use a quote from one of my participants who says that the Museum of Transology was like a weapon of survival. Like, that's a very particular framing of something, very intense word. So you have to like go into why are they using these phrases. Even one of my participants said something was cool, and then you have to be like, what does it mean for it to be cool? Right? So it's stuff like that. It's like documentary analysis in real time.
Yeah, it's like you guys are having to decode yourselves, working with multiple languages, because to listeners that only speak English, imagine the US and the UK, the differences in slang. Now imagine every single city in Latin America has its own form of phrase. We all say things differently. So I can only imagine you sitting there being like, okay, what do they mean by this? Because also Mexican Spanish is its own thing. And then on top of that, you're also dealing with possibly very local slang. It's a lot of work. I can only imagine transcribing all these things. I do not envy neither of y'all's positions.
It was very interesting because also I had to kind of sort of be very conscious of my Spanish. Some of it could be as neutral as possible, which is not. My accent is there. Getting excited, you throw in the more kind of colloquial words. So I was like trying to bear that, and but also being kind of honest about it and be, yeah, you know, I'm a Chilanga from Mexico City. This is just going to be out there when I speak. When it came to talking with migrants, I mean, the translation, at the moment I could like understand, of course, and carry the conversation and be like, oh yeah. So I actually asked much more staff members, what do they mean by acompañamientos or kind of other practices that they would already have a specific kind of word for it. I just wanted to know what it meant for them and how would they describe it, right? So those kind of things when I'm like, oh, actually, tell me more about it, happened with like this institutionalized language. With migrants, I was like, okay, I'll carry this. But when it came to actually transcribing, sometimes we were just laughing, like in this broken sort of Spanish that at the moment it made perfect sense. Transcribing and translating that, I'm just, how do I do that without butchering that? And, also accepting that it's not going to be a faithful translation. And that's just it. I can't be like, I just translated it very precisely. Of course, I made a super effort to be as close as, when it comes to Spanish to English, as close as it could be. And bearing in mind, I think that was the tone of the way they were saying that. But at the same time, it's like inevitable. The translation is gonna transform it. And I remember even one of my supervisors did say, all of the translations, you have to put a footnote for people that are Spanish speaking. So it's there. I learned that, in the book I talked a bit about it, like this idea of Nepantla, of like being in between worlds, and it's not, you're straddling, in migration, but I think it kind of covers, gender, it covers culture, when this in-betweenness is bound to also transform how you think and transform the deep listening. It was a skill to polish and acquire.
To kind of move us into talking about some of your findings, the first one's going to be quite heavy, but we'll talk about it. We'll see how you feel about it and all this kind of stuff. In chapter 4, you talk about migrant agencies and the NGOs, for those that don't know, non-governmental organizations. They are engaging in a form of hypervigilance. So they're surveilling the migrants that come to them, they're interviewing them about their journeys, they're asking them for proof of their journeys, they're asking them for passports and other forms of information to ascertain as to whether this migrant is, to put it in simpler terms, a good migrant or a migrant who is engaged in criminal activities. And if they've gained in criminal activities, they're usually not allowed aid. And so they're doing this partially because they want to avoid this kind of negative image of them arising through the association with kind of criminalized individuals. They don't want the state to intervene in what they're doing or kind of police what they're doing or stop what they're doing because they let drug cartels and human traffickers and all this kind of stuff into these spaces that are meant to be for people who need them. One of the things that kind of you argue is the hypervigilance is also a problem, right? There was a particular participant, Sarah, who had put up cameras without migrants knowing. What was it? It was like 12 or 16 cameras. And then there was a really interesting thing that you said, the hypervigilance is not just in stuff like cameras, but it's also in these interviews, but it's also in sometimes the architecture of the building and the way the buildings are laid out. I assume so the staff members have more visibility to what people are doing. I'd be interested to hear about that. They want to protect migrants from, and they also want to protect themselves from being associated with people who are criminalized. But they also say that they are these virtuous organizations that are kind of helping migrants. We're the people who the migrants go to, all this kind of stuff. We help them continue moving and get employment and education and all this kind of stuff. But like, how can you be doing that if you're not giving aid to most of the people who come to you, or you're treating everybody who comes to you with like a very high level of suspicion? And how do these things line up? And so this is something that you're talking about in this chapter, but a thought to kind of move forward is there's no easy answer, because if they stop being hypervigilant, there's a chance that something bad could happen. But then the hypervigilance is also an issue. So they're caught in this like weird bind. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
No, it's super interesting what you're saying, Hannah. And what happens a lot of the times is you have some staff members like Sarah, flat out saying, oh yeah, we're watching and becoming like this vigilante of this small community, and I have my infiltrators. And she, in theatrical way, she was saying very open about how was she managing kind of this dilemma that is very real, right? How people wanted to protect, and they say it like this: we want to be a safe haven for migrants, But at the same time, how do you reconcile? How do you also reconcile a context in which, there's a lot of organized crime in Mexico, and that's also kind of the reality. And unfortunately, it became kind of normalized, sort of this hypervigilance, suspicion, and doubting, just flat out doubting, no? And in the book, I explain it's not sort of an accidental doubting on people. It's a practice that keeps coming up when it comes to racialized individuals that have been constantly questioned on their humanity, on how good they are or not. So I kind of really wanted to bring that, in which, people are routinely questioned on their motivations, on their journey, when they came to Mexico, where they slept, what did they did, who they are. And you're asking this of people who have lost their homes, who have lost, important documents, who have been also maybe robbed in whilst kind of trying to get to the next point, or, they don't have anything with them there. And, all at the same time, as you're saying, like they sort of want to position themselves as, this alternative sort of institution or sort of space for migrants outside the state, outside the government, aside of the police. But at the same time, how is it that they end up kind of reproducing and replicating doubting and questioning on people, and it ends up like in this weird hierarchization of aid, in a very dehumanizing sort of way to treat them, to get to know them, no, to establish their relationship with them.
If we want to talk a bit more about the hierarchization of aid, the gendered aspect was really interesting to me, right? This positioning of migrants not only is this racialization and this good versus bad migrant, but also this hierarchization of vulnerability, like women and children, families, sometimes people with certain forms of disabilities or injuries, and then single men are right at the bottom and often don't get aid, even though, as kind of you point out, they are the highest percentage of migrant.
Because at some points it sounded like a lot of these organizations are infantilizing these people who have had very intense lives and, regardless of age, have had to make very adult and very intense decisions in their life, and yet they're kind of babied in certain ways.
I think it's so important and so easily left aside. So a lot of these organizations are local, but they have funding from the UNHCR, the government, some donations, but it's like the lower percent. So they already have sort of a model or an idea of the people they want to help, as you were saying, Hannah, like women, children, people that fit into that vulnerable, and even like they talk about victimhood, right? Men that are the majority of migrants also end up like being excluded from this aid and from that support, and being like, what, they can go work. A lot of them have just turned 18. There is like a really young type of masculinity, really racialized, but also criminalized. It's a way also to kind of exclude and in material terms pick and choose who they want to help. But also, as Paola is saying, this has important consequences on how we're thinking about aid and help, and it becomes infantilizing. Migrants say, I'm being treated as a kid, and they weren't like saying it bad way or even complaining, but it was this infantilization keeps popping up in the humanitarian sector, in which there's this sense of, at the end of the day, like superiority, and you're a underage person, maybe you don't know what's going on. It sort of then becomes very problematic when you have this hypervigilance, right? In which migrants are then say, at this time do you eat. Migrants eat, at this time they go to sleep. Sometimes their mobile is taking off. So it's an interesting way to have power over them, and that was kind of my argument there. And also thinking migrants have been through very traumatic experiences, through really heavy journeys, but also these labels of victim sometimes solidify that experience, and sometimes migrants feel, maybe the way they're understanding is not necessarily their experiences or the way they have endured this situation is not exactly kind of the framing that organizations want to fit them. When I spoke to them, a lot of say, well, we are victims of the economy, like much more broader structures they were thinking, rather than, victims of being robbed or like a petty crime. But the way it's being framed, it's very much, stratifying and sort of also giving these other very risky ways on treating people who have gone through difficult situations, who are very vulnerable and in precarious conditions.
Another thing we can talk about then, thinking about this vulnerability and this relationship between the migrant and the agencies and NGOs and staff there. I mentioned it earlier, but some of the staff seem to have a care for the migrants that doesn't feel relational. And Paolo, you had an interesting point about this.
My point of view mostly came from one, I think it was in chapter 4, where one of the migrants is talking about how a nun was asking them to be grateful for the work that's being done, and they sort of have to then be looped into this performity of, thank you so much, I would not be able to do this without you, where it's like, I'm sorry, you are a nun, this is literally your job. But, which is a really cruel thing to say, but I think it's a very significant thing to bring up because, as really well discussed in your book, these NGOs, a lot of them are religious organizations who have a thing that they're getting out of this, and what they're getting is congregation members, and there is a relationship in which everyone's doing a performance in order for the institution to exist. This is my way, I think, also connecting both of our analysis of your chapters, in that there's also an exploitation of the workers themselves. Especially, they tend to be very young, they don't have a lot of money, and it is required by their religion to do these acts of kindness, like quote-unquote acts of kindness. Not only are they doing missionary work that not only is a financial benefit, but also these people engaging in this don't have any money. They're coming in somewhere where they probably don't really know the culture or the language very well. It's a tit for tat sort of situation where they are also at the mercy of all these funders. So it is, when you come in, I can imagine you're in this strange ecosystem of dynamics and not just language, but like the performance of keeping this thing going, which obviously is extremely fascinating, but like I think the underlying current of sort of the things where you were poking holes in and, you know, like looking and exploring behind.
You sort of pointed the central and the gravity of it all, because like a lot of these organizations, and it's something when I was doing the research and it came after in the Viva, you know, it's like saying or positioning themselves as really nice and benevolent or goody-goodies in the story. There is this level of performativity, but also there's an end goal of that. And you're right, like actually a lot of the organizations require migrants to have a job or to labor, which in Mexico, in contrast to the UK, they can do. If they're asylum seekers, they can find a job. But then that also then implies really other very not so great practices. Like a lot of them were made to volunteer and to sell like donuts or food. And then obviously I asked, but they were very clear if the funding that migrants got from their jobs, how much of that went into the organizations, how much. And what was also like, obviously they said, oh, it was for the benefit of the migrant, right? Like, oh, it's good that they have jobs, but it makes sense in that sense. But also, you know, we're talking about people walking for miles and miles every day who are like very tired. Maybe they just want, you know, one day in which to have something to eat and to have a hot bath, and they're like, well, if you want to stay here, like this is what organization says, you have to get a job and you have to work. So again, like a lot of things, it was exploitative. The type of work, it was very precarious. People had accidents in the jobs, like it was also bad for their health. Some of them were in the cleaning sector. The type of products they were handling were corrosive. They had like already burns and other kind of things on their skin. And I think on a book chapter that I'm working, that's sort of the argument that now this has been taken off by the government itself. You know, it was so clever that the government now makes these centers for migrants that either are coming back or still crossing. The centrality is they will benefit the country whilst they're in Mexico, and they will work, and they will find them work, which then contrasts with this nationalism. But going back to this idea of the institution kind of having these organizations becoming much more professionalized and institutionalized, and those sort of aims having priority and being much more embedded into how people relate to migrants becomes the norm in these places. Even though, of course, a lot of staff, and just to kind of make it a bit more nuanced, it is true, like this staff also sometimes has to disengage. It's a lot of people they're dealing with and a lot of stories, so there has been a lot of work and interesting research on how they sometimes disassociate, they become a bit more cynical, or just to kind of get the work and not burn out. But to what extent is that being also propelled or solidified or enabled by this institutionalized mentality or script? Yeah, just to finish off this idea of like it being faith-based and religious. We were just speaking about how a lot of them are faith-based organizations. Some of them are not, but the more traditional and the majority are. And that makes invited for Catholic Mass, and they're very much in it, in the face. When I talked about the architecture, it seems like very unsettling, the way that is very Foucauldian, maybe panopticon. I had a flashback in some of these places. The setting here seems they're being observed all the time. There's no privacy, this sort of thing, right? And then when you put that layer of these religious motives, but also remembering back to kind of this colonial thing in which in Mexico and in many places of Latin America, the colonial enterprise went hand in hand with the religious mission, right? And so this idea of exploitation and of colonial subjects and will save their souls. So I think, there's like that already, sort of that structure that then I feel like the humanitarian organizations sort of start feeding much more, because there's already kind of that underlying, not only historical but still very present in many ways, that sort of colonial mentality and practice and structure. So that is sort of like readopted in a very humanitarian way.
Yeah, I can see that being very much a cyclical dynamic. And, things to also think about in the background is also visual. We were talking about young men being mostly the ones that are not getting this aid. And you have to think about, okay, all these other categories of colorism within Latin America that are also affecting all these things. And age. I grew up in the States. There is this undercurring narrative of young, dark-skinned men are going to come in and cause all this trouble without looking into nuances of even their own criminal charges. What if they were forced to do these things? What if they had no choice but to participate in activities that would cause some sort of aid or this exchange to not be given? Yeah, I was just, reading your book is a relationship between all of these things, and it's I think what made your work so fascinating to me, because I remember hearing about caravans, I remember hearing all these things, but it's very reflective and sort of even looking at how the UK does things with migration and ideal immigrants.
It's very easy to fall into kind of these binaries. Going back to the complexity of it all, a lot of the people I interviewed, the migrants, were like just turning 18, like 1/3 or even like half of them were less than 27. People were younger than me at the point I was doing the research, or even my age. So I was like, I can't believe this. But yeah, for instance, when you talk about when the discourse, for instance, on human trafficking, they're using that discourse to deter undocumented migrants, to make it out as something that they want to prevent, but also something that they're using against migrants themselves. And because the situation is much more muddy and messy, a lot of migrants, what do they do when they say that, oh yeah, I helped someone in their trajectory? Is the authority interpreting that as smuggling if they help their family? If they're not, of course there's also exploitation, those trajectories, of course that also happens. But I think it's quite difficult to cut across, those kind of good or bad situations. Then you have a very disappointing picture when the ones that want to help fall back on kind of this criminalization that they don't intend to, but ends up happening.
I just wanted to check, Erika, but is there anything else you want to add that we didn't cover or anything like that?
I guess just to kind of finish off, kind of the intent of the book was, as I said, very Foucauldian. With Foucault was like the spirit wasn't as conscious, and I can see it now much more evident. And I think I always like that interview he has with Chomsky, in which they're like debating, about power relations. An old one, but a good one. I really liked it because at the end Foucault is saying what should be sort of task of the researcher, of the social scientist, what are we here for, right? And I think at some point he does say something like it's our job to kind of go deeper, be a bit more critical about those institutions or those places, the universities that appear to be kind of neutral or appear to be kind of independent, autonomous outside, political spheres, and see to what extent, there's also power relations that are changing the way people interact with them. And so I think, at the end, that's what's that was the inspiration. Also coming to terms into which, it is a reality, kind of these organizations do incur into kind of these dubious and problematic things, but at the same time, also, having this wider picture in which the state and the government is forceful, and these organizations have to taking a step back and thinking more deeply on how to change some of these practices.
I guess to end in a very light note, there is a quote by Pitbull himself that says there's only one room that he plays to, and that is the room of improvement. Dale.
I love it.
Another one for you. Biggest room in the world. Room for improvement.
How did you find that so fast?
It was on my phone.
So I guess also to end off, in addition to Pitbull, do we have media connections? Paula, you had one.
Actually, I thought of another one while we were having this. So both of mine are music. So the first one I thought of was a song by Celia Cruz, which is who wrote a song called Por si acaso no regreso, which translates to "in case I don't come back," and it's just her talking about leaving things on the island of Cuba before good old Castro kicked her out and told her to never come back. And she talks about how just because you're moving for something better or for a promise of a better tomorrow, it still hurts and it's still a painful thing to leave behind home. And I was like, well, that's really sad. That's a really sad recommendation. But I thought of a Mexico-Puerto Rican connection, which is a really, really old song called En mi viejo San Juan by Javier Solis, who is a Mexican singer who visited Puerto Rico and then had to leave, and he was like, this place was great. So I thought a nice connection. It's about longing and missing and all these things. But yeah, those are my two recs.
Recommend as an amateur writer. I would recommend a Mexican author called Valeria Lizueli, and two books of her. One that has to do with migration and everything. I think it's she explains very well the predicament of migrants that are just crossing through Mexico. It tell me how it ends. It's in an essay form. It's not too long. A really nice book. And she also has a novel that I really like that is called Lost Children Archives. That is about a couple that is divorcing and they're traveling across the US. But I really like how she talks, kind of about this breaking of a family and of a partnership, but at the same time talking about the husband work that has to do with native population, and at the same time in a very sonic way, right? So all the time she's on recordings and this. So yeah, that's the fiction recommendation for me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Erika, I don't exactly know when the episode will be out. The release has been in shambles. But is there anything you want to sign off with or plug before we go?
Well, I don't know, I guess we will have to stay tuned to what happens.
If you want to donate to some organizations, please look into the description on our page, or we can also link directly to some organizations that could benefit you within your local area. Donate!
Yeah, and just thank you both so much for inviting me. I can't believe people are reading the book.
It was so good. It was really good. Thank you for finally joining us as well, because I asked you ages ago. Life happened to us.
Bye!
Bye! That was well. That was well.
All right.
Okay.
I'll fade out.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.